Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brian Gelman. I am the Senior Associate for Public Policy and Advocacy at the National Community Action Partnership. I'm joined by Lindsay Marsh, who's our Senior Associate for Special Projects Census Engagement. We're here today to talk about census and redistricting. This is the third in our series of civic engagement webinars that we're going on over the summer and continuing into the fall. At the end of these slides, I believe there will be links for the recordings and the slides from the two earlier civic engagement webinars. One was on registration and one was on like the difference between advocacy and lobbying. We also did a voter registration a couple of days ago, a voter registration webinar, just sort of like on the nuts and bolts of how to get folks registered and what 501c3s and folks who receive CSBG funds can do on the voter registration front. So those are available as well. And then we have one more webinar in the civic engagement series that's happening in October about the history of voting rights and what to look for in this election. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay, and then I'll be back at the end to help answer questions if necessary. Lindsay?
Great, thank you, Ryan. Welcome, everyone. This is a brief agenda of what we're going to do today. I'm going to echo Lauren and Ryan. We welcome questions. So please do pop any questions that you have into the chat. We'll answer them as we go, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. If any of you have joined me over the last 18 months or so, you know that the census has been my baby for the past year and a half. We're going to go through a census update. I'll do a brief touch on what the census is, but we've been talking about it for a while, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that. And then we're going to go into the meat of redistricting and what redistricting means to our country and community action. And then we'll talk a little bit about what you can do in the redistricting process. We've got a whole bunch of resources, and then we'll do Q&A. So let's get into the census. If you don't know, the census is something that we have been doing in this country since 1790. Every 10 years, we count all people who live in the United States. And when I say all people who live here, I mean all. We count diplomats, we count foreign exchange students, we count citizens, we count undocumented immigrants. If you live in America on April 1st of 2020, we want to count you in the 2020 census. I could go into a lot of detail. If you've got questions about that, pop them into the chat and I will address them. But the important thing today is to know that we use these numbers to reapportion Congress. There are 435 seats in Congress, and those seats are proportioned across the U.S. in each state based on population for the most part. There are a few exceptions. There are some states that are small in population, but still get one voting member in Congress. Vermont is one of them. Delaware is one of them. I want to say Montana and Wyoming. They all have one congressional district, even if they don't meet the population threshold to earn that seat. And then the rest of the states are getting allocations of congressional members based on their actual population. So there's a slide that talks about this later, but I want to say that 8 states gained seats in 2010 and 10 states lost seats in 2010, just because of the way that our population shifted in the U.S. The other thing that we do with these numbers is determine where we send billions of dollars in federal funding. This means LIHEAP. So the LIHEAP funding formula, the old and the new formula, both have a population part of that funding formula equation. TANF, Head Start, CSBG funding, rural housing funding, highway transportation funding, education funding. The census is one way that our founders built in to make sure that each of our states gets the appropriate and proper and fair allocation of dollars. Both of these reasons are important to community action. It's why we started the project that I've been working on, that I've pulled Ryan into, because we want to make sure that all people in our network have a voice in Congress, and we want to make sure that you're all getting the appropriate funding for your programs. Just to illustrate how this can impact, let's say there are 800,000 people in a congressional district. I believe it was about 710,000 per district after the 2010 census, and we're expecting it to be 800 or 820,000 after this year's census. If you miss 20,000 people in your community, then you now have a congressional seat that's representing 820 or 840,000 people, even though it should only be 820. It dilutes your voice. So that's why we care about this. Our founding fathers started this process because it's supposed to lead us to fair and equal representation across the states. Often it doesn't, which we will get into. So the citizenship, well, the census has had a really tumultuous couple of years. There was the citizenship question. There's a long story behind it, but the bottom line is that the Commerce Department, the U.S. Department of Commerce, tried to add a citizenship question to the census. It was struck down last June. It was finally laid to rest in July of 2019. But it caused a lot of consternation in communities where we advocate for a fair count, because it fear-mongered among immigrant populations and undocumented immigrant populations. And as I mentioned, we count everyone who lives in the United States, regardless of status. So that was a hurdle for the census. We got past it, but we know that a lot of damage was done because it was in the news, and it was still a fear that a lot of people who have undocumented status or even legal status who are worried that this administration will strip their green card or their citizenship if they were naturalized. Those are real fears that people have, and it led to a lot of people not filling out the census forms. COVID-19 has been a huge issue for the census. We were supposed to begin on March 12th with a nationwide campaign to get collected responses from every household in America. And it was supposed to end on July 31st. Non-response follow-up, where you go door knocking to houses that haven't responded, was supposed to start in May. It didn't start until July, and it didn't start nationwide until August. And now we find ourselves in this weird no man's land where we don't actually know when the census is going to end. It could end next Wednesday. That right now is the projected end date. Originally, the Census Bureau requested additional time until Halloween, but then they backtracked. So there is a huge political fight over this. There's legislation, there are legalities, there are lawsuits. It's been kind of a mess to kind of sort through. My sense right now is that the census will end collection on September 30th, which is a shame because we know that the people they're going to miss are our community members. So communities of color, people who live in poverty, people experiencing homelessness, immigrants, senior citizens, people with disabilities, the who's who of community action are the ones who are going to be hurt the most by this. If you have been doing census work, I just want to say thank you for everything that you've done. Even though I hope we have another month, that's my wish. We're pushing through as if we don't. So the graphic that I have on the right-hand side of the slide is on our Facebook page. We've sent it out a couple of times over email. If you haven't seen it and you want to do that, it's actually a really cool gift that Lauren and Alexa from our team put together. So we have an online campaign right now to encourage people up until that last day. And we hope that you'll take the time to share that. And if you have already, thank you. What else happened with the census? So in, I think it was July, time is a weird construct these days, the administration issued an executive memo that directed the Census Bureau to not include non-citizens, so to include only people who are verified American citizens in the redistricting. We oppose this as an entity and as the Census Counts Coalition because it disenfranchises millions of people across the country, and actually disenfranchises American citizens because let's say you live on the border and you are half and half. Half people who come in and use your facilities that live across the border in Mexico, or you've got a lot of undocumented people, they still have the same needs as a fully American community would. If you have 400,000 people in a community, you still use 400,000 people's worth of resources. You still use roads, you still have education, you still have needs. So those people still deserve that representation in Congress. Anyway, that executive memo directing the Census Bureau is a blatant partisan ploy. The census has been highly partisan this year. It's been used as a political weapon, which I have a real problem with, because we want to honor the Constitution and do what the Constitution told us to do. A couple of weeks ago, that executive memo was struck down. So the Census Bureau has been directed to continue their normal course of operations using all of the numbers collected to do that reapportionment, which is good news. Finally, I pulled this number last night. 96.2 is what the Census Bureau is currently saying as a percentage of households that they have enumerated. Basically, they're saying that they counted 96.2% of America. That's flat out false. I understand that they believe that they have done that, but some of those numbers come from an enumerator going to an apartment building, the apartment building front desk person saying you can't come in because of COVID, and then that enumerator marking off that house as completed, or that apartment building rather, as completed, even though they haven't talked to any of the households that are missing in that household, or in that apartment building. I hope that was clear. So even though the Census Bureau says that 96.2% of housing units have been enumerated, that is not true at all. And I don't know, Lauren, if you can find the link to the 99% fallacy article that I sent to the Google group, and it's a PDF. I don't know if there's a URL, but if you could pop that in the chat, that would be great. So there's still work to be done, and we're going to run right up to the deadline. So if the deadline is next Wednesday, we're still doing work. There's still coalition stuff happening. We're still working on a campaign to encourage people, and we hope that you can do the same. I'm about to go into some redistricting stuff, but if there are any questions about the census, where we are and what is happening, please pop them in the chat now, and I'll take a minute to answer them. Okay, I don't see anything. So now let's talk about redistricting. It seems like this really esoteric process, but it's important and it does matter to community action. Part of this is for congressional representation. We were founded on the belief that our government was of the people, by the people, for the people, which means that each person in this country is supposed to have an equal voice. I know I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the civil rights movement of the Black Lives Matter moment that we're experiencing now highlights that people in this country are not free and equal, that there is definitely a bias. There are two Americas in this country right now. And part of the work that we're doing is to make sure that everybody is equal. We elect representatives in Congress to do our bidding. Like, they report to us, they answer to us because we elect them. So every 2 years, that's why Congress turns over. So Congress has a very close tie with the districts that they represent. And so it's important to make sure that everybody has their fair share of representation. All right, so gerrymandering is one way. I think I've talked a little bit about redistricting. It's a process of making sure that all of our states get these congressional districts. Gerrymandering is one of the things that we're looking out for. Gerrymandering is a process, it was named in 1982. I put in a little cartoon because I think it's neat to figure out where the word came from, because it's a weird word, right? It was Governor Elbridge Gerry in Massachusetts who created this really weird district that somebody thought looked a little bit like a salamander. And so gerrymandering is a portmanteau of Jerry and salamander. They put it together and it became gerrymander, and so therefore gerrymandering. It's the process where you divide a state up into districts that will be benefit one party or the other. Instead of making fair, equal districts with like people, they carve out parts of a red town into a blue district to dilute that redness to make it a blue district overall. I've got some examples of this in the next few slides. So I'll hopefully illustrate this a little bit better. But redistricting is done through using those census numbers. Very few states have rules that say that these districts need to be fair and competitive. Iowa is one of the best examples of a non-gerrymandering state. Every year, even though it's a pretty red state, they have pretty decent competition in each of their House districts. It's possible for either party to win because they didn't carve all of the blue people into one district to make that one district the giveaway to the Democrats, so the other 5 districts could be Republican, which is what gerrymandering often does. Gerrymandering isn't just political, though, it's often racial. We see this a lot, especially in the South, but we see it all over, where districts are carved up to put all of the communities of color into one district. Again, so they have one voice where they may have deserved 2 or 3 if they had been fairly drawn districts. I think I saw a question in the chat. Okay, this is a Senate question, so I'm going to stop for a second and say I've had quite a few people speak to me about the Census Bureau and the percentage. Okay, sorry, there's just somebody who wants me to talk to them later, and I will do that. My contact information is at the end of the slide deck, so you can certainly reach out to me. All right, so how do you identify gerrymandering? So if you look at all these districts, there's something odd about them all, especially if you know those areas. So this district in Baltimore on the right-hand side, the Maryland's 3rd district, that's a really weird looking district. In Maryland, it tends to be the Democrats that gerrymander more than the Republicans. North Carolina, the Republicans tend to gerrymander more than the Democrats. And it all depends on who has control of the state house when redistricting happens. Illinois' 4th district is a really weird looking district. How can those people all be represented by one person with all that land in the middle? If your district looks funny, or if there's Austin to San Antonio is a really good example. Austin was carved up by the Republican state house a while ago to dilute the votes, the blue votes from Austin, to make it more of a red state. So these are just some examples. I think the next slide, yes. And so this is what it does, and this is how we care about this, because we want everyone to be fairly represented. So North Carolina, the 50.9 versus 49.1, those are the people who voted. But the 50.9% Democrats only got 44.7% of the seats. The 49.1% of Republicans got 55.3% of the seats. So there's a disparity between the state's demographics and how that's reflected in their state bodies. And if you look at these numbers, they're all slightly off, giving an advantage to one party over the other, which gives control to the minority in the state. That's what we're working on, and that's what we're trying to solve and stop today. Ryan, I'm going to ask you to come and talk a little bit about our public policy platform, since it's your baby, not mine. If I can throw you on the spot a little bit.
Hi, yeah, so
basically
this is the, yeah, sure, sorry, there's like a little delay, sorry to freak you out. So this is part of our 2019-2020 public policy platform that was approved by the Partnership Board of Directors. So there is a civic engagement section there that's titled Encouraging Civic Engagement that Allows Every Voice to Be Heard. It has to do with, a couple of different things. There's a piece there about voting and making sure everyone is heard through their vote, and then also folks being civically engaged otherwise through organizations in their communities. Obviously, this has a direct impact on the census and also redistricting. So we're probably going to, we're definitely going to update the platform for the 2021-2022 legislative session, and those discussions are going to start happening this fall. But I'm sure that civic engagement will continue to be a priority. So just wanted to note that.
Great, thank you, Ryan. All right, so what else do I have today? Community action in creating fair districts. So we've outlined a little bit of a problem, and we want to be able to be proactive and tell you how you can get involved in making sure that all of our community members get their fair representation. One of the first things to do is figure out how redistricting happens in your state. There are different ways that different states go about this. Most have their state legislature in charge of redistricting, which is one of the reasons why it's important to make sure that everybody votes in their state representative elections this year. 2 years ago is probably more important, but it's important that people go up and down ballot on their voting. They don't just vote for the federal elections. The state legislative level really matters as well. The majority of the states just have the state legislature do this redistricting. So they get their redistricting numbers, they figure out where the population is, and they divide up their own state into districts. Most of them also are subjected to governor veto. So if the Republicans or the Democrats, if one party holds both of those key positions in a state government, it's very likely that they can do whatever they want with those districts, unless there's some kind of change in how this is drawn. Few states have a state legislature where the governor cannot veto. A few states like Iowa, like I mentioned before, has an advisory commission. California, I know, and Colorado, where I live, has a new redistricting commission. And some are single districts, so it doesn't matter. So Vermont, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, and New Hampshire, Vermont have such small populations that they don't need a redistricting committee because it's all just one district. But this is important because there are about 10 to 12 states where community action might have a real voice in how your state is redistricted after the census is completed. The most gerrymandered states in the U.S. Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. Both sides do this. So we are nonpartisan as an entity. I'm not giving more grief to one side than the other. Both parties do this. It is not fair to people living in those states when it happens. If you want to see how your state looks on a map and to see if it makes sense to you, you can just Google Congressional District Maps, Colorado, and you can take a look at those districts. Sometimes you'll be able to see right away what gerrymandering is happening in your state. Sometimes it takes a little bit more digging, but if any of them look really awkward or really disjointed, or if you happen to know by looking at it that if one district carves around in a circle from one community or another, then your state has gerrymandering, and it's something that you should be aware of. You might be able to notice, because we're community action, how some districts carve up areas based on income or race. So that's something to take a look at. Once you get a sense of what's happening in your state, there are a few things that you can do to help. The first thing is to please help people to be counted in the census. We have 1 week or possibly 5, and it's very important to make sure that the people we serve have their households counted. If we miss 100 kids in your area, then you're missing out on $200,000 worth of federal funding for education. If I did that math right, $20,000, $200,000 over 10 years. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and it's not just the money, it's also that political power. So we really want to make sure that people are fairly represented. Vote, please vote. We sent out yesterday a toolkit on how to encourage people to vote. We are nonpartisan entities. We are C3s. We also are subjected to CSBG funding. So that means that we cannot do overt voter registration activities. We can mention voting, and the easiest way to do that is through non-CSBG funded personnel, sharing our voter gifts and images on Facebook. But please make sure that you are registered. Make sure that people in your household are registered. If you are 17 and will be 18 on election day, you can and should vote in your first presidential election. Please make sure that if you think you're registered, you really are. Maybe you sat the last election cycle out. Okay, it happens, but make sure you're registered, because some secretaries of state are really good about cleaning those records. Some are better than others, but you may have been cut off the voter rolls. We want to make sure that you have the power to exercise your right to vote in November. If you've moved recently, please update your information. Some states, I think Alabama's one, require an ID to vote. And if your voter ID doesn't match your voter registration, you might not be able to cast a regular ballot. You can and should cast a provisional ballot, but you might be denied that opportunity to cast your ballot if your information doesn't match. So please, please, please go to vote.gov. You can find your state's information there, and you can make sure that you are registered or update your information. Both of those things do help redistricting, even if it doesn't feel like they're completely connected. The census and voting and redistricting are the three pillars of democracy. So all of those things help. And then you can educate yourself on redistricting. I included a link here. Lauren might be able to pop it in the chat so it's readily accessible for you. But these are one-pagers, state-by-state one-pagers that talk about how your state does this. Again, there are about 10 to 12 states where public opinion really can make a difference next year when we do this process. And actually, I should have mentioned this when we talk about the census. So right now, the census is ending next week, possibly the end of October. And then the Census Bureau will clean that data. They will polish it. They will double check it. They'll do quality control. And they'll come out with these numbers. The original timeline, which we may be adhering to, is that the reapportionment numbers will be sent to the president by New Year's Eve, meaning which states get how many seats in Congress. And then in April, the Census Bureau is supposed to send the actual nitty-gritty numbers, so the redistricting committees across the country can begin to do the work of carving up their states into these congressional districts. So the redistricting will happen throughout most of next year. Virginia is an interesting case, as is New Jersey, since they both have off-cycle, they're called off-cycle elections for their states. They are the only two states in the union that have the odd year elections the year after a presidential, just to be really confusing. So this is the big political year because you have everything, all of the federal elections are up. A lot of the states have state legislative elections up. Virginia and New Jersey will elect their governor and their state legislatures next year. So they have a bit of a weirdness here because they're supposed to redistrict at the same time they're having a statewide election for state seats. So that's interesting. All that being said, figure out how your redistricting process is happening in your state. I can't ask, I can ask, but none of you have the time to become experts in redistricting. I'm hoping to be able to do that for you, especially in the states where public opinion has impact. But if you have the time and bandwidth, figure out when the public hearings will be held on redistricting in your state and go and have an opinion on those district lines. Advocate for fair district lines and make sure that your state representative knows how you feel. We started the Partnership Civic Engagement Google group for census work, but we also do advocacy work there. We talk about lobbying there. We talk about voting, and we will be talking about redistricting. All of that will happen. That's why we named it the Civic Engagement Group. But follow that because we'll push out information there. My goal is that we will have redistricting teams in all the states where we can make an impact, but that's to be determined. Figure out who's on your redistricting committee. It could be that your own personal state legislator or the state legislator for where your agency is a good contact. Ryan can speak more to this when we talk about advocacy and lobbying, but you should know who your state legislator is anyway, and you should tell them how you're feeling about things that are happening in your community. Knowing your state legislature, knowing the people who are in this process can really be helpful. One of the things that I mentioned on Tuesday for our Voter 101 webinar is that all politics is local, and I think that we have an opportunity to look at this year alone to see how much local elected officials have impacted our world. So getting to know your state legislator isn't just a good work thing, it's a good personal thing. I know that here in Colorado, the Black Lives Matter movement could have turned into a lot more rioting and a lot more looting and a lot more vandalism if the mayor hadn't handled it the way that he did. And so the mayor of Denver is an important position for me to look at when I'm casting my next ballot in that race. The governors of the country have been leading the charge against COVID-19. It has been a state-by-state response, and so people, I mean, there are some governors that have done a really great job at getting the spread of COVID-19 to stall. Others haven't done such a great job. That's something that you should think about when you cast your next vote for governor. But all politics is local, and we really need to start thinking about the local level. And local level state legislatures can really impact our agencies and how we do our work. Local groups are doing this work. It's not just us. I'm still pulling together groups that are going to be doing this on the ground, and that's something that will be coming. But the League of Women Voters, the Brennan Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU are all doing work on fair districting. If they're doing local work in your area, it's not a bad idea to get on the listserv just so you hear what's happening in the area. Jim Masters, who is one of our subject matter experts, is a manager of the League of Women Voter Candidate Forums, which is interesting. So you can always ping him about work like that. Somebody asked, what advocacy software do you use to pull your data? I'm not sure I understand the question. So if you could clarify that to Lauren, I will try to answer that for you. All right, and then we have a bunch of resources. So again, the redistricting fights, and they will be fights, won't happen until next year when the census data is delivered. If there is an extension passed, and we certainly hope that there will be an extension passed for the census, because we know that our community members have not been counted yet, and we want them to be included. The dates would shift to the reapportionment data. Instead of New Year's Eve, it would be delivered in April. And then the April deadline for redistricting numbers would be pushed to July. That does have some implications for states like California because of the way that their commission is structured, as well as Virginia and New Jersey. We really hope to see that, in part because there's no way that the Census Bureau, even if they end the census next week, can condense the 5-month data processing process they have into 3 months. And we think that there's a lot of quality assurance that will be missed. We think that there's a lot of deduplication that's being missed. And because of COVID, we know that the collection has been super convoluted this year. A great example are college students. Colleges shut down in March. A lot of college students moved home by April 1st. And so a lot of parents counted their college-age child in their home. If those kids were counted by their university because they lived in on-campus housing, that's one thing. But if there was an off-campus housing occupied by students who went home and those kids didn't fill out their census forms in their off-campus housing apartments, we have a real problem on our hands for those towns. I mean, my fiance went to school in a small town where the town's major economy is that school. So if those off-campus kids aren't counted there, that entire town is going to be at a disadvantage for the next 10 years with their federal funding resources. We share those concerns with cities. New York City has multiple universities with lots of off-campus housing. And if we miss those people, New York won't get their fair share of funding for the next 10 years. So it's a real problem, and we want to give the Census Bureau enough time to do that data cleaning and to figure out that this kid should have been counted on campus, or off campus rather, but was counted by their parents instead. So it's disheartening at best to think that the census is not being conducted as well as it could be. All right, so these links and resources, we encourage you to take a look. We will send out this PowerPoint. We're also going to send out a 2-page summary because not everybody has the time to rewatch something like this. So we'll give you the nitty gritty. I want to take a look at these numbers really quickly, just because I find them really interesting. So I mentioned earlier, there were 8 states that gained congressional seats after apportionment in 2010, and there were 10 states that lost congressional seats. This is again because of population shifts. So Illinois and Pennsylvania, Ohio, upstate New York, Wisconsin or Minnesota, Alabama. A lot of people are moving from those states. We're also seeing an increase in population in Colorado. I moved here 2 years ago. There are a lot of transplants out here. We call them transplants. They come from California, they come from the East Coast, they come from Texas. So the population is shifting in this country to the western states. We also see a lot of immigration happening in the southern states, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California all see really large increases in population. So those states should get more representation in Congress. That's something that we think will happen. There were 185 court cases filed challenging redrawn district boundaries since 2010. Those are mostly to challenge redistricting that happens with gerrymandering. So I find all of this stuff pretty interesting. I could probably wax poetic about this for quite some time, but I want to let folks take a look at these resources and familiarize yourself with what's happening in your state, and then feel free to ask questions, etc. Those are all the slides I have right now, which is great. We've got about 22 minutes. We can field questions now. I do want to plug that we do have that one more session in October where we're going to go over how the rights to vote were won in this country, and really prime people to watch out for things on election day. Some election protection rules, like, for example, if you're in line when your polls close, even if the polls have closed, if you are in line, you are allowed to stay until you are able to cast your ballot. No one gets turned away because they're in line and the lines are slow. Things like that we're going to talk about in October. And we will have the recording up for this one today at some point in the next couple of days. And we have the recordings from our webinar in July and the one in August. I will say that July one is getting a lot of play because people have lots of questions about what's legal and what's not. We honor the CSBG rules and regulations. We do not want to go afoul of those. We have worked with Cap Law pretty extensively to figure out what our agencies can and cannot do. And again, if you have non-CSBG funded staff, there are things that they can do that are perfectly legal and are encouraged, that doesn't go afoul of honoring the CSBG laws. So that webinar has been very popular and has a lot of really good packed information in it. There are also some do's and don'ts that Cap Law has put together that talk about the Hatch Law, the Hatch Act rather, and spreading the needle between being a C3 organization and CSBG funded. So we encourage you to take a look at all of those. All right, and as promised, for the questioner, this is my email address. I am Lindsay Marsh, so lmarsh@communityactionpartnership.com. We do welcome and encourage questions and afterthoughts. It's not always easy to think on your feet, so if you come up with something in the next few days, please do reach out. We're happy to help. I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm going to leave this up. The next slide is just a question slide, but if we have something in the chat, or if somebody has a question, please feel free to pop it in there. Jim Masters had to drop off, which is sad because he knows way more about this than I do, which is terrifying, but also he's a useful resource, so I'm sad that he had to go. I think the question is where did the Brennan Center one-pagers come from? And it's one of the links in this PowerPoint presentation. The Brennan Center has been really great about putting together one-pagers and basic redistricting information. Do you have any more questions, Lauren?
I'm not seeing any.
I find it hard to believe that I was so thorough that there are no questions, but that's why we leave contact information. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, then this is a primer. This is the first of many things we will be doing on redistricting, I hope. So we will have a more focused actions and involvement that you can do, especially if you are in one of those states where political, not political, but public opinion and pressure on elected officials to make these districts fair is possible. But we welcome questions, and we welcome you emailing us your thoughts about the census, about voting, about advocacy, lobbying, and about redistricting. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. The slides will be sent out, and these will be up on our website in a couple of days. Go get people counted in the census to do your best, and please reach out to us if we can be helpful. Thanks for joining, everyone.